Thank you to AFF for hosting and Roger for hosting. And David, thank you for coming. I know this organization may not be the most friendly to some of your views, so we really respect you coming out and what may be or hopefully may not be a outnumbered audience. But speaking of outnumbered, it's well over 90 out there. I see two people without ties up here, and I'm feeling a little outnumbered myself. So if you guys don't mind, I want to be a little more comfortable.
No conservatives left on the panel.
All right, there we go. Lost the red tie.
Yeah.
So to start off, what is right to work? Let's just define it. Right to work simply means that a union cannot get a worker fired for not paying them. That's it. Doesn't do anything else. Doesn't affect collective bargaining any other way. Unions, workers, they can still negotiate with employers and businesses for wages, hours, working conditions. Anything they could before a right to work, they can negotiate for after right to work, except for the union saying you have to pay us or we're going to get you fired. That's it. And notice I said pay and not join. Workers already have the ability to not join a union. It's called exercising their BEC, or in the public sector, their ABUD rights. But unfortunately, they still have to pay the vast majority of their dues in what's called agency fees. So right to work, you're seeing right to work states, they have higher population growth, they have higher wage growth. When you factor in cost of living, workers are making more. But that's all ancillary. All right to work does is say a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. So thank you all for coming out, and I look forward to a lively debate.
Great. Well, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Coming to a conservative audience is always an interesting opportunity to talk about these kinds of issues. So I appreciate you giving me that chance. So I want to make three main points about right to work. First is that the sort of economic evidence behind them is really weak. That evidence that they do any good is very, very weak. I'll go into some of the details, but that's sort of point one. Point two is right to work is not exactly what it seems. It's a little more complicated than it was just described, and I'll explain that. So this second is a little more complicated. And third is I want to at least broaden your horizon about unions and what they do. I think they are much more of a benefit to society than sort of the typical sort of conservative caricature. And so I want to, because that's really what right to work ends up being about, is about unions. And so I want to let you to think that in a broader way about them and their role in society and the economy. The first on the economic evidence, you heard Vincent talk about some growth or wages or any of that. So basic studies, the thing to know when you're looking through the evidence here is a good study should control for all sorts of factors that also might influence these kinds of things. Studies that do that basically find very little, if any, evidence that it has any effects on employment or job growth or the overall per capita income. In contrast, the research is pretty strong that right to work does lower workers' wages. It's pretty good evidence on that, even when controlling for all sorts of factors. So the evidence is really not so strong, then on right to work not really being exactly what it seems. So I appreciate the distinction between having to join. You never have to join a union, which is true. What you do, though, have to pay, if a union negotiates a contract with a company, you do have to pay these agency fees. That's because the law is a union has to represent all workers. They can't just represent those who are members. They have to represent all workers in their contracts. So a contract has to apply. You can't just say you get good wages, you don't. They have to give everyone the same benefits. Then also, if you have an individual grievance, you want to talk to the employer, the union has to represent you, whether you're a member or not, the same level that they would otherwise. So without that ability, you basically have the ability to free ride and not pay for services you're getting. Very few organizations survive in that kind of a model. Our law says that when a majority of workers choose to join a union, that union is the sole representative negotiating authority with the employer, and then on account of that, they have to represent everyone, and they can require people to pay for that benefit. The other thing about the thing about unions being more positive than you think, so the final point, so I'll be the first to admit, unions are not perfect. Just like corporations are not perfect. They are, but both are necessary and vital parts of any modern society, any functioning modern society. The unions perform two basic roles. They give some workers some power in the economy to negotiate with their employer. They also give workers some power in democracy to have their voices heard. And I think the democratic point is really very important here. So you go back to James Madison's ideas about how democracy should work. You have interest groups that sort of duke it out. If you can't control all interest groups or factions, so you want many of them, and you want them to have some relatively equal power, so that they can come to, in theory, a solution that's relatively good for everyone. Without them, you just have the employer side having lots of power in our democracy, or having more power, and workers having relatively little, and so you have one voice being heard a lot louder than others. Economic evidence is weak. Right to work is a little more complicated than it's made out to be, and unions as a whole are often quite positive force.
All right. Anybody want to pop in with rebuttals, or can I jump right in with questions?
I can talk about a couple of things,
Sure.
if that's all right. First of all, unions are positive, and they can be a positive. And right to work actually helps make unions stronger. When unions have to prove their worth to their membership and can't take those members' dues for granted, then they represent them better. And the statistical evidence backs that up. Last year was a little bit of an outlier. We saw a lot of union growth in New York State. But if you take the last 4 years, you're actually seeing the right to work states have stronger union membership growth than the non-right to work states. And it's a combination of several factors. First, it's economic. There's more jobs in the right to work states. Job growth in right to work states is greater than the non-right to work states, so there's more opportunity for union jobs. More opportunity for union jobs means more union members. Also, it means that they just can't take them for granted, and they have to show them that they're worth it. And by doing that, they serve their members' interests better because they have to earn their dues. As far as the economics goes, it is clear. Workers in right-to-work states, when you factor in cost of living, and that's one of those factors that you have to factor in because milk, rent, taxes in one state is different than milk, taxes, rent, gas in another state. When you factor all of that in, workers in right-to-work states are making about 4.1% more. And as far as the exclusive representation claim, that's the so-called free rider claim. I think free rider is a little derogatory. They're not free riders, as my good friend Terry Bowman, who's in the audience right now, current UAW member, he likes to say they're actually forced riders. Because whether or not the union, or the worker wants to represent themselves, they have no choice if the union chooses to represent all workers. And while some states may differ and may say that the union has to represent all workers, at least in the private sector, unions can have what's known as member-only agreements. And in fact, we're seeing this within the union movement with what we're seeing with worker centers right now. Even the AFL-CIO president, Richard Trumka, has come out and said that, hey, we just want to represent workers that want to be represented. Now, they do lose a lot of benefits, and David, I'd be the first if you want to join with me in saying that unions shouldn't represent workers that aren't paying them, and unions don't have to represent members that don't want to be represented, and we should give workers the ability to say, okay, I want to represent myself. So if the Center for American Progress wants to join Mackinac, we would love to work with you on ending the forced rider problem. And the last issue is democracy. Sorry, I'm going to use that outnumbered example really quick. Who wants David to buy the beer after this? Show of hands? Well, that's democracy. We're not a democracy in this country. First of all, we're a representative republic. And in that representative republic, it's constitutional, and there are constitutional limitations on what the majority can do. That's why we have liberty in this country, and if you ask me, when there's a conflict between liberty and democracy, we must always err on the side of liberty, because we can't have tyranny of the majority. We can't simply have 51% voting and saying, okay, the 49% has to give us money or has to pay for us.
So Vinny's against democracy and free beer? Rebuttal?
Yes, I like free beer, but I also like democracy. So the point, so we have democracy, it plays a key role here, and let's talk about unions as a relatively democratic organization. So first, workers choose the process that workers that unions become in a workplace is a majority of members choose to create a union. Then also, once you're in a union, you have the ability to vote on things like contracts, the leadership. You also could vote whether or not to decertify, so get rid of the union. Then but most of the time that majoritarian logic holds. And to me, that is part of a functioning democracy. There are times when individual freedom works and there are special rights, but actually the law is, and as we've enshrined it, is in this case, majority holds. And that's important because I think it gets to your conceptions of freedom here. So, so behind this logic is somehow this freedom that you should be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, but it's a really particular and peculiar kind of freedom. So think, when you work for an employer, think of all the things that you can be required to do. You can be required to, for example, shave your beard. You can be required to wear a uniform. You can be required to listen to political propaganda. You can, so you have your freedoms once you enter the workplace are different. They're not the same kind of freedoms we would have in other places. They, and so in fact, I would argue, I think you actually have the presence of a union and a majority vote, whether or not to create one, is more freedom than you have in other spheres of the workplace. And that's just on this negative idea of freedom or liberty, and which totally ignores the positive concepts. I don't know, sort of the idea that you need some power and agency to have true freedom. And sometimes that requires collective action to be able to have some power. And unions help give you that power. And so I am on the side of you actually have greater freedom when you have the ability to join a union, join together, and have majority rule.
I'm going to ask the first question. I'm going to ask it to you first, but I want both of you to weigh in on it. And that is, what, in your view, accounts for the decline in union membership over the last few decades? Because that is, of course, a pretty big social fact of the last few decades, and there are there's a lot of dispute as to what caused that I think colors this debate.
Yeah, so, the basic facts, just let's lay them out. So for the past roughly 40 years, about unions used to represent almost a third of all workers in the private sector workforce. That has declined to less than 7% today. In contrast, actually, in the public sector, where there's, and I think this illustrates part of the issue, the public sector has stayed basically flat for the past 30 years. Slight decline very recently because of some political changes. And so what you have is, because I think the majority of the rationale for why unions have declined over time is that the law is very weak and gives employers lots of power to choose to, if they wish, make it very hard for workers to join a union if they want. To give just one example, the law is so weak, so the law does protect your right to join a union, but if you are illegally fired, and if an employer illegally fires you for trying to exercise that right, the remedy is so weak here's what happens. You're fired. You say, well, that wasn't right. This is a basic right. I should be able to exercise it. You go, you file a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board. It will take them a period of time to adjudicate. Then there's a sort of a whole series of appeals. After all that process, which often takes years, the best you can get is to be given your back wages minus anything you earned in the meantime. And presumably you went out and got another job, because not many people can make it for a year or so without a job. So you basically get very little, which gives very little disincentive for an employer that doesn't want a union to try to make it very difficult for workers to join. Because you also have polls showing that roughly a majority of the public would like to join a union if they could. So you have a significant percentage of the public saying they'd like to join a union. You have very few workers actually in unions. You also have, where the law is different in the private sector, roughly the same flat trend. And you also have increasing evidence. There's lots of studies that show all of the things that employers will do, including firing workers, has increased over time. And so I attribute most of it's by no means the whole. There's clearly big changes in the structure of the economy that also matter, but I attribute it significantly to change in the law. And you can also see that when you compare us to other countries, especially Canada, which provides sort of some of the best cases, because they have different laws in different provinces, and you can see how much that really matters for union membership.
Why are unions in decline? Their model's outdated. It's as simple as that. Unions are still operating under an industrial revolution, turn of the last century, one-size-fits-all, adversarial relationship, us versus them mentality. They haven't adapted. They haven't taken individual worker skills into account. Most unions still rail against things like merit pay. So good workers can't get ahead in their steam. The only way that they can get a raise is through longevity. So workers that feel like, well, I can do a good job, I can work hard, they look at union and they think that they'll stagnate in their wages, and the only way that they'll get a raise is simply by showing up on the job, and it doesn't matter how hard they work. So going back to the democracy and what's happening with unions, a lot of workers also know that once they're in a union, it's extremely difficult to get out of a union. Workers should have the right to vote to collectively bargain, especially in the private sector. They need that right. That right is guaranteed under the Constitution with freedom of assembly. However, what we see with a lot of unions is that once they're in a workplace, it's next to impossible to change a union. If they don't like the current union they're in, it's next to impossible to say, well, I don't like the UAW, so I want to go to the Teamsters. It's extremely difficult. There's been studies done. James Shirk from the Heritage Foundation has done some great work on this, and found that workers that are in a union, less than 10% actually voted that union in the workplace. So if we want true democracy, true majority rule, we should have things like union recertification, which works not to get rid of unions, that may happen, but also can work to give workers the opportunity to say, this union isn't doing their job for me, I want another union to represent me. Because as we were talking about, most unions choose to represent all workers. So even in right-to-work states, where workers can say, you're not doing your job, I don't want to pay you, those workers are still forced to accept that representation. And when it comes to decertification is extraordinarily difficult. When a union comes into a work site, the union has experts that they can advise the workers of how to organize. The union can come in with a lot of resources to give to the workers. And the workers that do want to unionize can rely on the union to provide them with the ability to organize their fellow workers and apply for that election, or as we see sometimes with a card check election, which means that there's no secret ballot. But now when it comes to decertification, on the other hand, the workers get zero help. In fact, it is illegal for the employer to do so much as allow workers the use of the company copier, because that would be considered an unfair labor practice. And I would beg to differ and say that the National Labor Relations Board does have a lot of teeth, and there are remedies for workers that feel that either their employer or in some cases their union is abusing their rights. So why are unions in decline? They have to adapt. They have to advance. And we're starting to see that with the worker center model right now, where they're trying to bypass even the card check election, not have a secret ballot or the regular election, and just represent some employees. Now, unfortunately, they're focusing more on politics and special interests than they are actually on representation. What would be a great way for the unions to not only survive, but actually thrive and move forward is to say, okay, you know what? Let's try to change that exclusive representation. Let's try to just represent the workers that want to be represented, and let's act as service organizations. Let's act as training organizations. Let's say that the workers in our union are the best trained and the best able, and they're more expensive than other workers, but you know what? They're worth it. That's why you need to come to us. That's how the unions can move forward, not by reinventing the old model and staying in the turn of the century industrial revolution, one size fits all.
Can I
Sure.
jump in there? So you mentioned this worker center idea, which I think really goes to show that your claim that unions, if they wanted to, could only represent their members. They can't, as you know. The law is very clear on that. Very clear. Unions have to represent everyone. Therefore, there's been part of this worker center is a non-union organization that can choose to work with and represent just people who pay dues. It's a totally different model, and they're seeking to escape the law that regulates how we deal with unions. So I think just even mentioning that example shows that some of the claims you were making earlier are not accurate. Then the last thing is sort of I want to also rebut is the idea on unions need to modernize. Sure, every organization, they need to, and you will find examples of really backwards and really forward-thinking unions. And the idea that so have in your head some of the unions that have been around at quite a long time, but really represent the kind of workforce that I think you might not think they represent or can represent, where it really is about individuals and individual differences, individual talents. Writers guilds, lots of writers, television writers, movie writers are unionized. You also have actors. You have professional athletes. You have this whole idea of thinking about making contracts for individuals and how to best use their talents. And you have a whole, so you definitely have unions that are growing, but even those unions have a very hard time growing, and no union basically is growing in density because the law makes it very hard to organize.
I'm going to have one more question, and this one's I'm going to start with Vinny, and it's a question about liberty. And correct me if my premise is wrong, since both of you know more about this issue than I do, certainly. But my understanding is that what right-to-work laws say is that companies may not offer people employment on the condition of their paying dues to a union. How is telling a company that it can't offer that kind of arrangement an advance for liberty?
Because what it's doing is it's balancing the playing field. The playing field is tilted. There are things that make it extremely easy to unionize, and there are things that forces a company to accept a union whether they want to or not. Perfect example is if somebody comes to you, knocks on your door and says, I want to paint your house. You have every ability in the free market to say, no, take a hike. However, if you apply the union rules, and obviously if you haven't joined an HOA or something like that, then they come back and say, well, no, a majority of your neighbors said that they want to paint their houses hot pink, and everybody on this block has to paint their houses hot pink. Then you have to negotiate with that person and say, okay, well, how much? And guess what? If you don't negotiate in what's called negotiating in good faith, it's another privilege that the unions have, then you can be brought up on charges, and they're called unfair labor practices. So when you talk about liberty and you talk about the ability of a corporation to say, well, no, right to work infringes on their ability to say, well, we want you to pay a union, it's balancing the playing field. And their liberties are already infringed upon via the way Taft-Hartley, the way the National Labor Relations Act, and other labor laws already say the things that they have to do. So what it's doing is it's actually equalizing it.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, the premise of your question, I think, is exactly appropriate. That look, there's different freedoms, different times, different places, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea of right to work is a very particular and peculiar idea about liberty or freedom. It's a really narrow conception. It only sees it one way. And what I think is important to understand about seeing liberty in that way, it leads to, and many claim it doesn't, but the research is very clear on this point, it leads to a decrease in unionization. Unambiguous research on that point. Academic research, but also just look at all of the 10 states with the lowest union density are right to work states. It's very hard to debate that point. And so that really is what's underlying this issue is the ability of unions to exist at more than just a really small level.
And if I can just respond, please go out and do your own research. Obviously, just don't take our word for it. Look up the last 5 years for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every year, they put out a union membership survey. And they report on union membership rates, and they break it down by state. And what we're seeing across the country is union membership rates are dropping precipitously. Last year, thanks to New York and one or two other non-right-to-work states, that picked up. But on the aggregate, the last few years, we are seeing a huge drop in union membership. And that drop is coming almost exclusively from the non-right-to-work states, as those states are shedding jobs, as they're shedding union jobs. But the right-to-work states are adding union members because they're adding jobs and they're allowing the unions to prove their worth and not only survive, but also thrive. So go out, do your own research, go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, look up that union membership survey, do the math yourself, and you'll see which way union membership rates are going versus right to work and non-right to work. And one last thing about the company and the ability of to contract with the union and the liberty argument. Companies don't have the ability to say, we want you in a union. It's called a company union, and for over a century, that's been illegal. If a company gets too cozy with the union, it's illegal for, and the term of art is thing of value. It's illegal for a company to give what's known as a thing of value to a union. So essentially, you could see 100 years ago why people were a little skittish of saying, okay, we want to come and unionize you, and then the boss just says, oh, no, we have our own union, don't worry about it, and he's pulling the strings behind the scene. That's illegal. So when you talk about the liberty argument for, well, why can't a company just pick a union? Because that's also illegal.
We're going to move now to audience questions, and I would like them to be questions and not just ruminations on the meaning of existence. So, in the back there.
Yes, my question, maybe I should stand with him, more of the audience can see me. Sorry, everyone. My question is for both panelists. What do you think of the idea of repealing laws that actually forbid unions, that require unions to represent all workers in a given workplace? I mean, if the free-rider problem is such a problem, maybe that's the approach we ought to take and let the union represent only those who are willing to pay dues and leave the other workers on their own, and then they'll actually be able to make a choice as to whether they want to be represented or not.
It's a great question, David.
Yeah. So, we have our law is a compromise. It was a compromise of sort of how you structure industrial relations to give reasonable power on both sides. Other countries went about that compromise in different ways, in ways actually I think would have been better. For example, many countries have basically what you propose. And Germany, for example, union just represents, can have minority membership, they can represent just those who are members. but they also have other powers that enable them to be on relatively equal footing with employers. They have, for example, seats on a corporate board. They also have these things called works councils that other workers, union and non-union members, discuss basic workplace practices, how sort of rules are implemented, how to improve production, etc. And that kind of a process, changing the law so that only workers, unions only represent those who want to work, I think would be a good thing, provided it was part of a structured solution that gave workers power in other ways. Because what you would potentially do there is just weaken the union and not give them something else of value to have a relatively even playing field with employers.
I agree with David. I think, and yourself, the question, I think it's a great idea. It should be something that should be explored both on a state for public sector workers and on the federal level for private sector workers. And like David, I also think that it should be combined with other reforms. A early compromise could be instead of just saying, well, you can have 5 or 6 unions come in, and we're also seeing this push at the National Labor Relations Board to push what's called micro-unions. And without getting into too many details, essentially what a micro-union is it's a hyper-specific collective bargaining unit. Right now, let's use Walmart as an example. If you want to organize a Walmart, you have to organize the entire store. If the micro-union concept, which I feel is illegal, catches on and the National Labor Relations Board certifies it, then instead of having to organize all of Walmart, if you can't get the 100 employees at the store, you can organize 2 out of the 3 guys in the deli department. And if you can do that, then you can get their foot in the door, and all the rights and privileges that go with that go to the micro-union, such as the ability to contact other employees, having the employee contact information, being able to use company bulletin boards, being able to post stuff in the store that the company can actually forbid until the union is fully organized. So a good compromise, at least to start, would be a one or none concept. So essentially, you have one union that organizes a work site. They have to get majority plus 1, preferably by a secret ballot. And then the employees can say, yes, this union represents me. Yes, I want to pay this union. Yes, I want this union to negotiate for me. If I have a problem with my employer, I want this union to go to bat for me. Or no, I feel I can represent myself better. I feel that I can negotiate a better contract with my employer. And if something happens, then I feel that I can go to my employer and solve the problem myself instead of having to go through a union. One of the things with exclusive representation in the current system is that employees in most cases have to give the union the right of first refusal if they have a grievance or a problem with their employer. So taking those small steps first, I think, could be a great solution. And yes, we should aim to the eventuality of saying that workers that want to represent themselves should have that ability, and unions that don't want to represent workers that aren't paying them should have that ability also.
Other questions up here in the front?
So I guess my question is sort of a 3-part thing here. It's an excellent discussion, but you guys seem to be debating over that you both agree that unions are generally declining, but no one seems to here be making the claim whether it is a good or a bad thing. And I actually don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. I want to know why I'm wrong. Why do I think that unions declining is not a bad thing? When it comes to what economist Henry Hazlitt said, there's the seen and the unseen, and I tend to think that unions are pulling from the demand or labor side and are taking away from the supply or entrepreneurial side. I mean, Hayek also states that no one has all the knowledge required to organize an economy. So is it possible to make the claim that unions, through organizing, through forcing themselves into the workplace, might actually be distorting price signals arbitrarily? I mean, what if it doesn't reflect what the employer can do or what he's planning in the future? What if them organizing is stopping a future expansion or future other jobs?
So
Sure.
is union decline a good thing?
Oh no, it's a terrible thing, and let me tell you why. Basically, it's virtually impossible and I defy you to find a good example of a democratic society that has a strong middle class that does not have a strong union movement. Basically, if you want a strong middle class, which I assume you all do, maybe that's a bad assumption, but you need a strong union movement. The clear, strong correlation between the decline of the union movement and the decline of the middle class over time. States, same thing is true in states. States with a stronger middle class have a stronger union movement. Across the world, countries with stronger union movements have a stronger middle class. And let me get to this. So you asked sort of, can unions distort price signals and all that? Of course, like anything else, there can be distortions. But the basic thing that unions do in the workplace is they give workers some power to get the gains of their productivity. And what we have had the economy doing for the past 30, 40 years is productivity has risen steeply. But basically people's wages are flat. That is the fundamental problem in today's economy. It is why the economy is in terrible shape, because we have no consumer demand. There's no consumer demand because incomes haven't risen. Incomes haven't risen because workers have no power. The way workers have power, it comes in one of two ways, and I would assume this is a conservative audience, so you would like the unions for this reason. You can have, workers can have power because the government sets mandates and says the minimum wage you gotta pay X, and then workers all of a sudden have a whole lot of power, or they can actually negotiate on their own and come to an agreement with their employers. Because they have not had that ability, you've had a dramatically weakened middle class. And to give you an idea of how important the unions are to the middle class, the studies, so there's plenty of other things that have contributed to the weakening of the middle class. The economy has changed. Gains in education is more important. But the studies show that the decline of the union is as important as the rising gains to returns to education. So you think once, sort of the debate is all about focused on how you sort of boost people's education. Well, we also, in order to rebuild the middle class, we got to boost the union movement.
Do you want to tackle that? Or
No, I would love to. Especially unions in the private sector, yeah, they are a good thing. The problem is that what we were talking about, that tilted playing field, that's the problem. You want to talk about a free economy, free markets. Workers that have specific skills should be able to band together and say, okay, we have a specific skill, you want that skill, you want us to give you the fruits of our productivity, you have to pay us a certain amount. But the employer, on the other hand, should have the ability to say, nah, I'm going to go over here, I don't care how good you are, I'm going to use workers that maybe aren't good. And then the consumers have the ability to say, well, that employer, his products fall apart all the time because his workers don't know what they're doing. They should have the ability to say, we're not buying it. End of story. The problem is that with the union movement now, there are so many laws and so many mandates on employers with the unions that there is no free market. So unions are a good thing, and workers banding together and saying that we deserve these wages because we have this skill set, and if you don't like it, we're just not giving it to you, that's a great thing. But it's when the government comes in and says, no, you have to negotiate in good faith with them, that's when you start to see problems. So building the union movement to say that these are qualified workers that can produce something that nobody else can, or better than anybody else can, is a great thing. As far as the middle class goes, you look at a lot of the very heavily unionized states, and you're right, the middle class isn't doing well because, look at New York City for an example. A lot of middle class people, look at DC, can't afford to live within the city proper, even though they're very heavily unionized states, because the cost of living is so much. And as far as wages go, wages are on the rise. And unfortunately, I don't have the great aggregate wage data, but I did bring data from the two right-to-work states right before Michigan. Oklahoma, which passed right-to-work in 2001, the average weekly wages averaged around $539 a year in 2001 when they passed right-to-work. The next year, it was $551 in 2002. By 2012, wages had risen to $801. So much for right-to-work, lowering wages. Indiana, don't have as much data because they recently passed right to work, but in 2012, the year they passed it, average wages were $774. The next year, after Right to Work passed, it was $793. Now, unfortunately, we're too soon to know what the wage data is for Michigan, but as you can see, even in the Right to Work states, wages are rising. And all of this is government data. It's Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's not finessed. There's no there's no statistical mumbo jumbo or magic. I'm a lawyer. I don't understand that, but it's just the basic wages that are reported to the government. It's government data that says even Right to Work states, wages are rising.
Can I jump in?
Very quickly, because I would like to get one more question.
Sure. Raises, I mean, come on, you all know, you experience every day the economy. Wages are not rising, but you mentioned Oklahoma, which I think is very important and gave you a kind of example of the evidence that is used to support Right to Work. Very weak. Nothing to control for, and I don't know, an oil and gas boom that might be addressing wages. And so actually, if you look at Oklahoma, what Right to Work should affect, the employment Right to Work should affect is manufacturing, not other sectors. Manufacturing is really where manufacturing employment has declined ever since Oklahoma passed Right to Work. Not because of Right to Work, but because of larger changes in the economy, jobs actually moving to even cheaper labor elsewhere, China, etc.
Let's talk about that for a second. First of all, you brought up oil and gas. Here's when we were talking about what's wrong with the union. Union focusing more on special interest than representation. Yeah, oil and gas boom in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is facilitating that oil and gas boom. Yet you have the AFL-CIO, even to the chagrin of some of their member unions, coming out against things like the Keystone Pipeline. That directly hurts the potential jobs and wage increases of their members. So what do we do to grow the union movement? Let's focus on representation. When you focus on special interest, you focus on things that they take their eye off the ball, and they're working on things that could be in direct conflict with their own members.
All right, I think we have time for one more question in the back there. Yeah, you.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask, I know we've talked a lot about the private sector. In the private sector, if you're an employee, you can find another employer. If you're a customer, you can find another company. In the public sector, if you want to ride the metro, you have one option. And a lot of these unions have, in the boom times, been successful in advocating for higher and higher benefits that have led to, some estimates say, multi-trillion dollar unfunded liability. So how do you deal with that fact that there is this trillion and trillion dollar unfunded liability, and how do you square the fact that for government jobs there's often one person, there's one entity that's doing the hiring for one particular job, so there's not necessarily competition from there's one metro, there's not multiple.
I'm going to let Vinny take this one first, just because he's been able to have the last word on most of these questions. So.
I like having the last word, the first word too, but what you have with government unions is you have this vicious circle. You have government unions that give to political candidates. The political candidates get elected, and now they have power, and they have the power to increase government salaries, increase government jobs, giving the union more members, more money, more power, which the union can take and now turn around and give to the elected official for their re-election. And it's this vicious circle that goes on, and everybody's happy except for the taxpayer who's stuck footing the bill at the end of the day. So that's why you're seeing those huge liabilities. It's also that you have politicians, and they look at the pension, and they look at the pension issues, and they go, oh, well, let's see. I can make these promises to these government unions. I don't have to pay for it to really do anything. I don't have to raise taxes on my constituents. The union's happy. My constituents really don't know what's going on, and I get reelected, and it's great. And then future generations are the ones that are stuck paying for it. Now, unfortunately, that's been happening for decades, and you were talking about some of the boom times where a lot of these pension obligations came from because the politicians said, well, we have surpluses, so let's just make more promise and unfunded liability promises with pensions and with benefits. And unfortunately, now the bill is coming home, and you're seeing it in Detroit, you're seeing it in towns in California, and the real problem is that you have these public sector workers, hardworking firemen, policemen, teachers, and they were promised the secure pension. But what happens when the city goes bankrupt? What happens when the unfunded liability of the town, or in some cases we might even see a state or two, just simply can't afford it? Those policemen, those teachers, those firefighters that have been promised a secure retirement, the well comes dry. And it's coming dry because of the unsustainable pension obligations and the unsustainable promises that politicians in the past have made. Now the
So-
answer, I'll just,
I'm sorry,
I'll wrap it
I
up.
wasn't
sorry.
trying to interrupt. I thought you were done.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
The answer there is to give a secure retirement to the individual, to move away from those typical pensions, which are known as defined benefit plans, into a defined contribution plan. And let each individual teacher, firefighter, policeman take that pension with them, both public sector and also private sector, and say, okay, I want to teach for 5 years, and it doesn't matter if I vest or not, because each of those 5 years, this state or my employer has contributed to my pension, and I can take that with me. And there's a lot of arguments, well, what happens if the stock market goes up and down? And there's this concept called annuities. And if you're not familiar with an annuity, essentially what that says is you can buy into a certain fund, you basically give them a lot of money, and then 30 years down the road, they guarantee you a payout. So we have the ability now to do the hybrid plan of all the good parts about defined benefit, that guaranteed payout, but also have the freedom and the individualization of the defined contribution plan of the 401k, so all those public employees can take it with them and the taxpayer is not on the hook for future generations.
Great. David?
So the premise of the question is basically unions are to blame for budget deficits for governments and for pension liabilities. So that's roughly what I take the premise. I realize that is the conservative line on lots of things, but it's woefully simplistic and inadequate and really is largely about scapegoating. It's really sort of shocking to me that that's the logic. We had a Great Recession. You all familiar? Tanked the economy, wrecked state budgets, whether or not you were unionized or not. They all were in deep trouble because their tax revenues went like this, but their demand for their services went like this. That created problems for all states, whether they're unionized or not. Then specifically on the pension obligations. If you look about 5 years before the Great Recession, most public plans were just about fully funded. Main things happened. We definitely had stupid games going on, but those games happened in states that were heavily unionized and not heavily unionized. We also had lots of states not paying regular contributions. The way you sort of have the fund work out is you pay into it every year. They weren't doing that. And then you had the stock market crash, creates these huge liabilities, but the dollar value, you should know, is very dependent upon how you value future liabilities. All those really big numbers, most of those really big numbers you hear, are assuming everything is invested in government bonds. Pensions don't invest in government bonds only. They invest in a diversified portfolio that over the past 20, 30 years averages about 8% returns. When you take those, there still is a liability, but it happens because they didn't pay money in they were supposed to, there were some stupid games, and there was a Great Recession. So, and those happened in union and non-unionized places. So it's really, again, and I would link it back to the right to work fight. This is where I started my discussion. The premise about unions that I think too many conservatives have is wrong. They do dumb things, but they also do very good things, and on a whole, they are a positive force in society. If you want a middle class, you need them. And this really sort of underlies the debate about right to work. It's really about weakening unions, weakening the middle class, giving power to those who already have it. And the final thing I want to just sort of touch on that I didn't really get to touch on here is the logic, the economic logic of right to work. In theory, so I've talked about all the evidence that it has no impact on employment, all those kind of things. The logic behind it really says you make workers poorer, you pay them less, and that's going to be good for the economy. That is the trickle-down logic we've been operating under for the past 30 or 40 years, and I realize the conservative movement bought wholeheartedly into it, but it has been a failure, a deep failure. The economy has grown slower for the past 30 or 40 years than it did previously. Wage growth has been very, very weak. The real way to grow the economy is to strengthen the middle class, get the boost in demand you need, get the innovation and entrepreneurship that comes from a strong middle class. And so I think you really want to rethink your conception of unions and all these ancillary issues that are, or not even ancillary, issues related to them, scapegoating them for problems, government budget problems, and right to work. So.
Well, we are supposed to be closing around now, but I have allowed things to get off schedule. If you don't mind, I'm going to waive the closing statement so we can get to the,
yeah,
the free
let's go.
beer
Don't want to stand between anyone and free
that,
beer.
that we've been debating earlier. So I hope you'll join me in thanking these dynamic and thoughtful speakers.